All right, hello everyone, and welcome back. This is Professor G, and today we're going to be talking about the Second World War, the Second Great War of the 20th century. We are probably, I'll just go ahead and say that I am going to split this video up into two parts. The first part is going to be primarily focused on the beginning of the war, the causes of the war, what led to the Second World War, why did it happen, how did it happen, leading up till about probably till about 1940 when the war began in Europe. The second part of the video, I'm going to explore more of the leadership of the Second World War, what happens in the year 1941. Two major things happen in 1941, and kind of an exploration of how the war ended in the two theaters in which it was fought. So for this first video, let's talk about the start of the Second World War and the events which led up to it. There's some primary background information that kind of sets the stage for this to happen. The Second World War, in many respects, is a continuation of the first. And more often than not, I think a lot of historians would agree that the Second World War is a direct result of what happened after the First World War, specifically speaking with respect to the nation of Germany. So, the First World War, if you recall from last time, and if you don't recall from last time, please feel free to go back and watch those videos. The First World War had a tremendous impact on European society, not just the European society, the society as a whole across the globe. I mean, this is a world, it's called a world war for a reason. The Great War had a devastating impact all over the globe, but specifically, most of the fighting took place, and as a result, most of the damage took place on the continent of Europe itself. That's where most of the lives were lost. So, this, of course, is not great for uh, political stability, for economic stability, and you see the aftermath of the First World War. You see that impact specifically in all the nations, but specifically in Germany. The Great War radically destabilized the German economy and society. Um, I put this picture in here. This is a picture of German children playing with stacks of money. You may have heard a little bit about what's referred to, the time period is referred to as interwar Germany, the period of time between the ending of the First World War and the start of the Second World War. Um, from about the late uh, early, we say 1918 to 1920, till about the 1930s, the German economy was in complete and utter shambles. They experienced what's referred to as hyperinflation. This is where you get the devaluation of German currency. Currency basically mid 1920s meant little to nothing. It wasn't worth much of anything, and the German economy had to, as a result, had to revert back to sort of a barter and trade system. And all of this was a result of what happened after the First World War. So the First World War in the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, um, the the First World War was blamed on Germany. Now, of course, I talk about this in the videos on the First World War. Of course, this is it's not, the blame doesn't, from a historical perspective, the blame doesn't fall completely and solely on German soldiers. It's more of a it's more of a unified type blame. There's a lot of people to blame. Most of the European nations are to blame. European society as a whole, with its emphasis on imperialism and the capitalist impulses of the late 19th and early 20th century, those are to blame. But Germany, as a result, Germany is placed with the responsibility of the First World War, and as a result, Germany is the nation which the other nations can place blame. When I say place blame, not only is it a moral thing, not only can the other nations point at Germany and say, you caused this, it's your fault, but there were tremendous economic repercussions placed on Germany as a nation. Um, Starting off with an Allied blockade of Germany, which limited food and natural resources into the nation, and also including Germany being responsible for paying back reparations for the war to nations like France and the United Kingdom. So, a tremendous economic burden on Germany, and as a result, the German economy in the 1920s essentially collapsed. There's no more German economy. Um, the other Central Powers face no better than Germany. What was once Austria-Hungary in the First World War, uh, Austria-Hungary basically collapses after the First World War and is divided into nations like Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, parts of newly formed state of Romania and Yugoslavia, parts of which once belonged to the nation of Austria-Hungary. Poland as well is granted its statehood. So Germany's really the only the only central power that survives the First World War. Austria-Hungary collapses, and of course, what was once the Ottoman Empire collapses as well, being replaced by various French and British states, as well as the newly formed nation of Turkey. But Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, following the First World War, is just done with. It's collapsed. Germany is still there, but as I said before, the German economy tanks horribly after the First World War. All of this creates a sort of power vacuum in the region of Central Europe. Because of the destabilization that was caused after the First World War to these European economies and societies, this kind of creates an opportunity for strong men to emerge and for very authoritarian type governments to emerge. What I mean by authoritarian, I'm also going to use this word here, totalitarianism. Totalitarianism, authoritarianism, um, refers to a type of government in which power is situated in the hands of either a single person or a small group of people. So the government's very top heavy, with power being centralized at the top and then kind of proceeding from there. So when I say totalitarian government, a government which basically runs kind of like a monarchy, kind of like a kingship where the king's in charge, what the king says goes. It's just kind of a modern version of that, where you have rulers such as Benito Mussolini or Adolf Hitler, who have an iron fist type control over their country, over the military, over the economy. So after World War One, that it, as I said before, World War One destabilizes Europe politically and economically speaking, and this creates room for authoritarian type governments to rise. And this is exactly what happens, for example, in Italy. We have this gentleman here in the picture to the left of Hitler. Benito Mussolini takes power in Italy. In Germany, of course, Adolf Hitler takes power. I say of course, but to be honest with you, when I used to give multiple choice tests on this at a college level, one of my multiple choice questions would be I'd always have like a couple of multiple choice questions and then like an essay question, right? And one of my multiple choice questions would be who was the leader of Germany during World War II? And you'd be surprised the number of people who got that wrong on a regular basis. I'm sure they just didn't really care and weren't really paying attention. But anyway, so um, in Italy, Benito Mussolini takes power. In Germany, Adolf Hitler. In Japan, um, General Tojo is in charge of the military forces that are invading Manchuria, China at the time. Eventually, Tojo is elected to what's kind of like a prime minister type position in not feudal Japan, in Japan in the 1930s. I really need to make a video about the political structure and dynamic of Japan. It's really interesting at the time if you want to look into it. So technically, Japan was ruled by an emperor, Hirohito, but the emperor of Japan had the same sort of function as the Queen in England of the United Kingdom at the time. It's more of an honorary role. It's more of a symbolic role. So Tojo's the equivalent of a prime minister in charge of Japan, and comes from this sort of military background. And in Russia, we have Joseph Stalin, who replaces Vladimir Lenin. If you recall from the World War I video, Russia has to drop out of the First World War due to a revolution, the Communist Revolution in Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution, led by Vladimir Lenin, the overthrow of the Russian monarchy and the establishment of Communist Russia. After Lenin comes Joseph Stalin, who is also, like Lenin, a bit of an authoritarian, not a bit of authoritarian, he was an authoritarian. Okay. But at the same time, I talk about the rise of authoritarianism in Europe after World War One. But to be clear, there are very democratic movements that happen after the First World War. You see this in countries like the United Kingdom, with one of the first universal democratic elections that take place. Also in countries like Turkey, following the fall of the fall following the fall of the Ottoman Empire. That's too many following the fall. That's a tongue twister for me. You see a democratic election in Turkey, as well as the United States. It kind of harking back to U.S. history, well, since this is technically a U.S. history class, there's a lot of issues surrounding voters' rights, surrounding Jim Crow laws, all that kind of thing going on in the United States at this time. But on the whole, the expansion of the democratic process is taking place in countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, as well as places in the Middle East like Turkey. So, yes, the rise of totalitarianism on the one hand, but also in other Western powers, the expansion of democracy and democratic election on the other. So, kind of two very opposite ends of the political spectrum take place after the First World War. But it's the rise of totalitarianism. This is what's going to be what's going to start the Second World War. It's going to be due to the aggression, the military aggression of places like Italy and Germany that we get to this. So let's move along to the 1930s. So several major conflicts happen in the 1930s, all of which kind of set the stage for, all of which you can think of as kind of culminating into the Second World War. This is why it's kind of hard to date. Like when people ask me the question like, okay, well, when did the Second World War begin? It's it's a deceptively simple question, but it's difficult. You could talk about when it began for Germany, or when it began for the United Kingdom, or when it began for Japan, or when it began for the United States, sort of independently. But collectively speaking, like if we're talking about like the World War II as a whole, when did it begin? It's really hard to say. It's hard to say because of all of these sort of smaller conflicts that eventually kick off the much larger conflict. So you have, for example, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. Mussolini, when he was elected, part of the platform he was elected on was to rebuild the Roman Empire, rebuild the Italian Empire. And so Mussolini wanted to expand Italy's power into North Africa. And so you have Mussolini invade Ethiopia. You also have the Spanish Civil War. Spain would not be involved in the Second World War directly, although they would later on go on to support Hitler economically, providing resources and stuff. But Spain went through a very bloody civil war directly prior to the outbreak of the Second World War. If you want to include that as part of the Second World War, some people do. Also, keep in mind the Japanese Empire. I kind of talked about this when we talked about the First World War, but Japan, by the 20th century, Japan has established itself as a major world empire, and it's going to greatly benefit from the First World War. Yes, it lost a lot of troops. It was involved in heavy combat, but in terms of like territorial holding, Japan will take the territory in, for example, mainland China that was held by Germany. Also, if you remember, there was a conflict early on in the 20th century between Japan and Russia, in which Japan would take modern day North and South Korea as well as parts of northern China, Mongolia, that area. So territorially speaking, the Japanese will greatly expand their empire after the First World War. Of course, this expansion itself is going to bring them into direct conflict with nations such as the United States, also kind of perpetually with nations like Russia. Um, but in 1937, Japan is going to carry out an invasion of mainland China, beginning in the Manchurian province, a very ruthless and bloody campaign. So some historians will in fact start the Second World War there with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. This results in Soviet-Japanese border conflicts, especially in northern China, modern-day Mongolia, as I mentioned before, and of course tension between Japan and the West. By the West here, I mean the United States and the United Kingdom over contested territory in Southeast Asia and also in the Pacific. So all of this is setting the stage for an outbreak of conflict. World War II didn't come out of nowhere. It's like this gradual buildup from the early 1920s into the 1930s. 1930s, as you can see from this list here, things start to get heated. Multiple conflicts start to break out across the globe, and these conflicts are going to kind of carry out in other areas. So, now, when most people think World War II, however, most people think Adolf Hitler and the European theater. So traditionally, a lot of people would place the start of World War II with Hitler's aggression and Hitler's expansion of the German nation in 1938, 1939. So I created a video on Nazi ideology, sort of explaining a lot of the mindset and motivation of the Nazis. And in that video, I talk about how and why the Nazis came to power. Um, if you want to take a look at that, I think it's very helpful to explain how this happened. Again, it's not a coincidence, and I think we easily forget the fact that a person like Adolf Hitler was democratically elected. The German people at the time wanted Hitler in power. Hitler made a lot of promises to the German people, a lot of Hitler's promises to expand the German Empire, yes, to get people back to work, to improve the German economy, to reclaim Germany's former glory, all of this stuff. And by the mid 1930s, Hitler is living up to his promises with the remilitarization of the German army and navy and air force. All of this kind of revitalizes the German economy. And by the late 1930s, Germany is doing very well for itself. It's rebounded from its depression and is now one of the leading military powers of Europe. And Hitler's going to immediately take advantage of this. So, what happens 1938, 1939? So, and of course, I should back up a little bit and say that nations like the United Kingdom and France, they saw what was happening. Okay, this wasn't something. It's not something that Hitler did in secret. Um, the UK and France knew that Hitler was rearming Germany. They knew that Hitler had political and territorial ambition to reclaim parts of Central Europe that Germany lost following World War One, but they didn't want to provoke Hitler because they knew that possible that provoking Hitler would lead to another conflict. And they really didn't want another conflict because their economies were just now recovering from the First World War. So things like when Hitler, for example, occupies Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1938, 1939. So when Hitler occupies Austria, France and the UK basically let it happen. They're not, again, they're trying to avoid conflict. They're not happy that Hitler is doing this. A lot of people are outraged, of course, that Hitler's doing this. But the rationale is, well, the Austrian people are a Germanic people, and this territory was part of Germany at one point in time. So we'll just kind of let Hitler do his thing and hope that this sort of quells his thirst for expansion. As I talk about in the Nazi ideology video, there's this German idea of living space, this idea that Hitler wants to expand Germany beyond its traditional borders to, well, not its traditional borders, to reclaim the land that once belonged to Germany. So he does this through, first of all, the occupation of Austria. This isn't a military campaign. The same with Czechoslovakia. The issue here surrounds, so Hitler, as you can see on the map here, occupies Austria, occupies Czechoslovakia. The next place that Hitler is eyeballing, of course, is Poland because he wants to kind of unite this area of Eastern Prussia back to Germany, and he wants to reclaim this land that was taken from Germany after World War One to reestablish Poland as a nation. So, Great Britain and France both ally themselves with Poland with the hopes that this will kind of deter Hitler. Okay, this is a public alliance. It's not sort of the secretive alliances of the First World War. Great Britain and France publicly align themselves with Poland in order to say, like, hey, Hitler, this is our ally, in order to support Poland militarily in the face of German aggression. And we'll get to that eventually. This doesn't deter Hitler at all, and in fact, in a kind of a simultaneous move, Hitler will both. Sorry, I think I lost my PowerPoint here. Hitler will invade Poland late 1939, while at the same time invading Poland, declare war on the United Kingdom and France. 1940, Hitler will launch his invasion of France through the neutral territories. At the time, they were neutral territories. So you probably heard of France's defenses along the French and German border, as you can see on the map here. Hitler will negate those defenses by driving his troops through neutral territory through the Ardennes. Maybe this map will give us a better view. So in a move very similar to what happens in the First World War, the idea is that Hitler will swing through, if you go back and watch that video, the idea is that Hitler will swing through, at the time, the neutral territories of the Netherlands and Belgium into northern France, take Paris, and by taking Paris, the French would surrender. That was the plan of the First World War. That's also basically what Hitler does during the Second World War. Hitler will invade through the Netherlands, through Belgium, and will take France, very quickly. So in May 1940, the German army invades France. By June 1940, France has surrendered. Okay, so in a time span of just 3 months, Hitler conquers France. I say he conquers France. So as you can see from this map, the northern part of France will be under Nazi control. At the same time that Hitler invades France, of course, Mussolini declares war on France and invades France from the south. A sort of puppet government of Vichy France will be established. It's supposed to be a neutral nation, but of course, economically, most of their trade and most of their resources are going towards Nazi Germany. But France will be split into two between Nazi-occupied France and the Vichy government of the southern France. So by 1940, Hitler has conquered most of the territory he wants. I also forgot to mention that Hitler will invade Denmark within a few days. We'll take Denmark, and from there we'll proceed to take the nation of Norway, as you can see on this map. So Denmark, Norway, France, Austria, Hungary, Poland, East Prussia, all of which now belong to the Nazis. So by 1940, Hitler has basically won the war, at least the war that he's fighting. So in 1940, the powers. So when we talk about, as we'll talk about in the next video, um, World War II is divided between the Allied powers and the Axis powers. 1940, the Allied powers were the United Kingdom, France, and Poland against Hitler, against Germany and Italy. France will fall, Poland will fall. So by the end of 1940, it's just Germany and Italy against the United Kingdom. Now, of course, a later ally will be the Soviet Union. But at this time, the Soviet Union and Hitler had signed a non-aggression pact allowing Russia to take over some territory in Eastern Europe, and at the same time agreeing that once Russia took places like um, uh, Estonia, Russia will, of course, will try to take Finland. They'll fail at that. Um, Parts of the Baltic region here in Eastern Europe. The idea that Germany would give Russia a large portion of the Eastern Europe in exchange for Germany controlling Poland, but that they after that would be it. That they would agree to kind of split Europe there. So by the end of 1940, Germany has the land that it wants. Despite the fact that the United Kingdom is still in the fight, the United Kingdom by 1940 doesn't really pose a serious threat to Germany. Germany will carry out an air campaign throughout the late 1940 and throughout most of 1941, what's referred to as the Battle of Britain, where the German Air Force will carry out a series of bombings against the UK. But Germany by this time has basically gotten what it wants. Now, mid to late 1941, all of this is going to change, which I will talk about in the next video. So, that's all I got from now. Remember to tune in very soon for the second video. The second video will pick up with the year 1941, the two major events that happened, the end of the war, and the outcome of the war. All right, I'll see you all later.